very much, Mr. Harris. Before I open up for questions, I just wanted to say that this seminar is jointly organized by the Institute of South Asian Studies and South Asian Studies program. So with that, can I welcome questions, comments, observations? Yes, please.
Hi. Coming from someone with very little knowledge of India, you said Gupta, I also haven't read the book, says there's no inability to get a handle or grip on the poverty problem since there's no responsibility, no agency. Does he make any mention of, because you know in your paper, I'm just curious, what about the NGO sector in India? Aren't there lots of NGOs out there fighting the fight and actually making it an issue and promoting it, and there are policy levels or grassroots? There are thousands of activists.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think he actually overstates his case that poverty is normalized, routinized. You know, I referred to the furore when Planning Commission produced its new estimates of the poverty line a couple of years ago. And there are certainly lots of organizations, NGOs out there that are concerned with poverty. Yet it's also true, distinguished sometime Belgian economist, now Indian economist, Jean Reds, did an analysis not very long ago of the content of op-eds in one of the leading English language newspapers in India, indeed probably the most serious newspaper, well, probably in the world actually, the Hindu, doesn't believe in jokes. Yeah, sure, the Hindu had carried op-eds on matters relating to poverty and so on, but greatly outweighed by, you know, stuff about India-China relations and this sort of thing. And then there's a question of, you know, of what it is that NGOs do. I hesitate to sort of, you know, to join the bandwagon that knocks the NGOs, and of course, for many people who work in different, it's what we might call civil society in India, the term NGO is a term of abuse. You know, they wouldn't want to be described as an NGO. An awful lot of NGO activity, you know, is concerned with really addressing the immediate, you know, people's immediate needs. No bad thing, but there's no way in which they're really addressing the structures that cause extreme poverty. Yeah, so.
Sorry.
Actually, Roller Joy did have his hand up, but he's sitting hidden away over there. So,
okay, Roller Joy, and then Anu. Thank you.
Sorry.
No, I just want to push you a bit further on the different responses by different states. You mentioned Kerala, Tamil Nadu.
Usual suspects.
Yeah, Maharashtra and West Bengal. But I just wanted to push you on West Bengal, where I know you've done field work, in addition, of course, to Tamil Nadu, where it seems we all know that the citizenry and the voters were more politicized and aware of their rights than, say, compared to Uttar Pradesh. But it seems, and I don't know what Tim Wesley and was about, the state has been woefully inadequate in delivering, this is West Bengal, on health and education, to name just two, where you would have normally have thought that a communist government, which was there in government for over 35 years, would have actually been more successful than Amartya Sen's and others who studied in some detail particularly the school education system. So why would you think that this happened?
No, I think it's a good point, and I think that in sort of comparative work that I've done, seeking to explain differences between states, for example, in that level of child malnutrition amongst children. West Bengal, difficult case. It seems in many ways anomalous. The work that Tim Besley and others did, in which they sought to measure what they call the poverty elasticity of growth, i.e., how much does so much growth do to reduce poverty, putting it in rather sort of simplistic terms. They work on measuring the poverty elasticity of growth across Indian states. Actually shows West Bengal as being second only to Kerala. And actually much higher than Tamil Nadu. And yet, yeah, you're right. We know that I think it is it's a real indictment of left-front government over those 30-odd years that they did so poorly in regards to education and healthcare. So it's a case which seems sort of somewhat contradictory, internally kind of contradictory in different ways. Again, whether the limitations of the left-front government in West Bengal can be put down to the way in which bureaucratic action produces arbitrary outcomes. Don't know. That strikes me as being unlikely.
I'm sorry, pardon, Ms.
Sorry.
If I understand you correctly, because I haven't read Akhil Gupta's book, is that one of the main one of the things he forgot to look at, or he didn't look at enough, was the class/caste angle.
Yeah.
Is that what you're saying in a way? And I think again it could be tied into the NGO question, because it's always a question of patronage, right? And when you talk of this structural violence, do you think that it can really be removed until the idea of inequality is addressed?
Until the idea of what?
Of inequality.
Yeah.
And it's given that, it is the given that caste and therefore Indian society is an unequal one to begin with, basically. That's the kind of feeling I get from bureaucrats. Why would we treat these Adivasis or these lower caste people?
Yeah.
Why would we pay a servant working in a house more than because that's their lot? That's it. So do you think that it would have, the Indian state can ever get out of this problem of, gross inequality until it sort of faces this in the face?
Yeah. I mean, what you're saying, I think only underlines underlines one of the points which I was making contra Akhil, that he says quite specifically that this isn't the outcome of the indifference of officials. I mean, what he's trying to say, of course, is that it can be terribly well-intentioned, but things still go wrong. But I think that is to underestimate the significance actually of the indifference of officials to people who they perceive as being inferior. Think of one of the stories in Stuart Corbridge and Co.'s book on Seeing the State, about the way in which an poor Adivasi woman is received in a government office. The kind of thing that those of us who done field work have almost certainly observed. Yeah, and I think of Myron Wiener's book on the child and the state in India, 20-odd years old now, but Wiener in that book sets out to try to answer the question of, why is it that the Indian state sort of reneged on that constitutional commitment to realizing universal basic education within 10 years of the promulgation of the Constitution. And he says it pretty much in so many words. It's very hard to explain this without thinking that a lot of politicians and officials, even now, don't really believe that it's a good thing for those people to have an education. or to have very much education. So, I think I really don't think that the idea of structural violence is a very helpful one, but there is extraordinary injustice, in my terms, which relates to the extreme inequalities of Indian society, and which are still, in some important ways, legitimated or made to seem normal by caste thinking. Of course there have been lots of changes in caste and so on, we all know that, but hierarchical values remain tremendously important. And yeah, I do think it's what has also happened, I think, and this is a point that Jael makes in her book. It's a point made very well, I think, by Pathologies in some of his writing as well, is that social justice has really come to be reduced to the idea of affirmative action and especially for OBCs, as I say. It's social equality for OBCs. OBCs having access to certain privileges from the state. There's no bigger sense of social justice than that. That may be, overstating the case, but I think that there's a lot of justification.
Vishnu, please.
John, I think there's a point. It's good that you brought in Myron Wiener's work, because a lot of people who talk about resource crunch, resource deficits, while talking about India not able to do this and that. He says that a lot of policies are actually the result of the prejudices of the senior civil servants, those who thought that the poor people, certain class of people don't need education. But then there is this point which is made by Sudipto and others. They were disaggregating the bureaucracy and seeing the senior echelon of bureaucracy as national. But somewhere this nationality doesn't get translated well when it comes to the lower rung of India's bureaucracy. So there is a disjunction. There is a kind of picture of bureaucracy which is almost fractured between the higher and the lower. And because of this fractured bureaucracy, things don't get done. I want to hear what you have to say about that, because there's a view which suggests that that's what really is. I have two more things to say. One,
go ahead, sorry.
Yeah. The other thing is about disaggregating Indian state. Then a lot of disaggregation happens at looking at the national state and the provincial states. There's a disaggregation happens at looking at different levels of the state within provincial and different elements of the state. I want to know a little more about, because at one point you were not very happy with this idea of disaggregated state, because after all it drops off this characterizing a state and then doing something about that. So I want to hear a little bit about that. Third, the final one is about when you take a kind of Marshall's view that a lot of the rights discourse is all about state anticipating poor people, potentially causing instability in the system, thinking of rights as a way of really addressing that issue. Doesn't it really take away from the agency of the poor in India, who are actually struggling, not in all cases, but actually struggling for rights? There are a lot of struggles for rights, which also happen. And what do you have to say about that?
Okay, thank you, Vishnu. First point, what you remind me of the suggestion made by an economist called Lant Pritchett a couple of years ago that India might be described as a flailing state. And what he was saying was that, no question, India is not a failing state. pretty well all its South Asian neighbours come up fairly high on these various indices of failing states, but India is clearly not a failing state. He is using the word flailing to refer to circumstances where there's a kind of disconnect between the head and the limbs. And that's what he says the state in India is like. He has very high regard for the caliber and for the motivations of many senior bureaucrats. But there's no connection between them and it's a very poor connection, a disconnect between them and lower levels of the bureaucracy. But I think that it's a metaphor which quite appeals to me, provided I think that it doesn't, as it were, let the senior bureaucrats off the hook. That's the problem. That's the problem with it. Because in some senses, it is their responsibility that things go so badly wrong at lower levels. So of course, they too are subject to transfer. And I'm sure we both know of senior IAS officers who've rarely been in one job more than about 18 months at most. Very often very good officers get moved because they run up against vested interests, politicians, and so on. So I think that sort of flailing state image is quite useful up to a point. Up to a point. Disaggregating. I think what Akhil does is to disaggregate in the sense of saying, well, what does the state mean? The state means only what people experience in day to day. They experience through the day-to-day practices of officials. And that's an important point. But as I say, I think it himself at other points speaks of the state much more in sort of Weberian kind of terms, as in some sense being a unified actor. But I think the sorts of disaggregation really is important. I mean, looking at the conflicts and tensions between different parts of government, for example, and the implications of that is surely important. And then, of course, the significance of relationships between states and the centre. So all of those points are well taken. Sorry, Vishnu, I've lost the third one.
The rights discourse.
Yeah. Yes. I think that. That was too flip of me to say it's all about class abatement, because I actually argue, funnily enough, with Nirja in talking about her book that she's too negative about the potentials of rights legislation in terms of providing a certain sort of point of leverage for people to organize to secure those rights, as I think happens to some extent in the context of, or certainly happened to some extent in the context of the employment guarantee in Maharashtra over the 30-odd years, 40 years that program ran, and which maybe operates in Narega as well.
Akhil Gupta is that probably it's too much of a cultural argument. It's the culture of corruption that is pervading everyday life. And in this cultural argument, Akhil Gupta also says is structure, because you say that he does invoke structure, a la Johan Galtung. The problem is, so it seems like it's a cultural argument which has more to do with the environment, the practices and the norms of that place, rather than the social distribution of power, which is leading him to describe everyday practices in a certain way, but not really helping him to tease out why they're happening in the first place. I think that is the real problem with Akhil Gupta's. And then contrast that with the political economy or the economic sociology of other states, where you probably have a different structure in place, call it structure or culture, which is actually producing public service delivery. And in some senses, Akhil Gupta is unable to tease these things out because in this culture there is no politics, or there is no class or caste or structure built into it, which would. Now my question is the following. The question is that it's true that India has huge problems. It is also true that parts of India have done well. It's also true that literacy promotion today is not the same as it was at the time of my reign. Today it's poor quality schools. It's not enrollment anymore. There are huge problems, but the nature of problems have changed. Right? When you look at a transition from, let's say, an Uttar Pradesh to a Tamil Nadu, or an Uttar Pradesh to a Himachal Pradesh, it's not just Tamil Nadu, it's also happening in Himachal Pradesh, or let's say Bihar as well tomorrow. Or when you look at a transition from literacy promotion at the time of my demeanor to literacy problem that facing literacy promotion today, where would you point your finger? Is it more a kind of Achimoglu, Robinson, Barrington Moore kind of thing, that there's some kind of a pressure from below coming to inhabit the earth and creating a different kind of structure, a different kind of culture, whatever you call it? Or is it some kind of a double movement that Karl Polanyi himself was a little bit confused about, in the sense that he thought that every kind of economic system is socialized, except the market system, which he thought was not socialized. So, do you think that some of this counter movement, which you think is coming about in some of your other reflections, is coming about because of pressures from below, or because of the way people perceive ideas at another level, more to do with leadership than with pressures from below, but ultimately in the long run they do deal with problems below. So basically my questions are two. One is that, is my understanding of your understanding of Akhil Gupta right? And if that is the case and you really want to tease out the problem, then where are some of the solutions really coming from? Are they coming purely from below, or are they also coming from an alternative kind of culture that is coming out of different kinds of ideas?
Well, I think your account of my argument is, I think, fair. Yes, and I think that he's very concerned to try to explain why it is that poverty is regarded as normal. In that regard, I think it is very odd that he doesn't really say anything about the sorts of points that Anu was making about the indifference and frank hostility, maybe, to people who are perceived as being inferior on the part of officials. Okay, so yes, I think that your account of what I said is very fair. Secondly, where does change come from? I think I am a little bit of a sort of Polanyian in the sense that I think that there has to be a coming together of people actually from different classes around if you will, a reform agenda, and that part of that. A very important part of that is changing ideas. So yeah, I do think it's important that there are people like Jean Reyes and Aruna Rai and Harsh Mandel and all the rest of them, who are trying all the time to make the case, if you will, for development as opposed to growth. Akhil himself at some point refers to the fact that, in the days of the Hindu rate of growth, as Krishna called it, India growing at kind of 3%, 2.5%, 3% was considered more or less normal, acceptable. And ideas really changed very radically about growth. So let's change ideas about poverty. But I think on Polanyi, to the extent that I think that there has to be a coalition of different forces in which changing ideas are very important.
Shorten.
I wanted just to share.
You have read the book, I think.
Yes. Yeah. So I want to share my impression on this book with you, since I also read.
Yeah.
And mostly I agree with you, whatever you mentioned today, because he misses many points. But mostly I was really disturbed by his idea on Indian state, and he describes the Indian state is an incoherent agent, the kind of violence. Right? So, and most of that, and also I was disturbed by his illustration. But I think this is his best way to illustrate Indian state from the grassroots level. And this work is not about the top-down perspective on Indian society or Indian state or institutionalization or Indian society, the transformation of Indian society. And he doesn't ignore, actually, the benefits of economic reform in 1991. But if we look at, if we go to the real village level, if you look at the people, the noble ordinary citizens, or at Tahsildar level, or village level, then people might not have another option to look at state. What is the Indian state? Because this might be the best option, which Akhil was describing as Indian state. Because people are thinking or considering Indian state through their experience with the local level of bureaucrats, right? So my sympathy was more with Akhil. Of course, I agree with you.
That's fine.
Yeah. And and based in terms of Robert's question, I think Akhil didn't extend his discussion to like social mobilization. Where people are disturbed by Indian bureaucrats, their corruptions, but he misses his discussion in this book. But he doesn't ignore this.
Sorry, it's just that we have 4 more questions to get to, so you could keep your conversation right now and talk to Professor Harris after this small video. Is that okay?
Just very quickly, I mean, I think we actually share, to a very great extent, our reading of the book. And I think, if I read it as a book precisely about how people experience the state, how the state is constructed through their encounters with state officials, through what they read of what is going on in the local press and so on, then I think it's a strong. There's a very strong sort of ethnography of the state there. But it doesn't really solve the puzzle that he says the book is about. The book is actually about something else than what he says it's about. There's a sort of fundamental kind of disjuncture between what is claimed and what is presented.
Thank you for waiting, yes.
Surya crisis. So what is your take on the response or the lack of it from the Indian bureaucracy to the expositions of suicides among farmers and starvation deaths in states like Andhra Pradesh and elsewhere, which the Maxis Award winner Sainath has exposed in The Hindu? And secondly, Amartya Sen has generally presented a positive correlation between democracy and development. Do you think that model has failed in India?
The first question, I think, how has the bureaucracy levels responded to farmer suicides? But I think to really come back to the point that Anu was making about really the implications of hierarchy, acceptance of inequality as being sort of normal and quite justified. So in that context, it doesn't really surprise me that this hasn't been so much of a concern for bureaucracy, although it has, of course, been a concern for some politicians who have sought to actually perfectly reasonably build political capital for themselves through, being seen to address some of the problems which are thought to have caused farmer suicide. The question of relationships between democracy and development. That's a big story, and I think for Sen is that if you understand development in terms of expansion of freedoms as he does, then there is an intrinsic connection between democracy and development. From large N sort of cross-national studies, that there is no very clear correlation between democracy and development, or between authoritarianism and development.
Ganesh?
John, thank you for providing us a very systematic reading of the book, so some of us can now think whether we want to read it or not. But we had this opportunity to hear Akhil Gupta some years ago. But none of these I think it must have been some preliminary ideas. I'm not sure who was present from this audience. But I'm just wondering whether this notion of structural violence, which he uses, and I think, is there a kind of a difference? Does he situate it in terms of, say, Kerala, or say the site which he is studying, which seems to be Western UP? And of course, there is Western UP in terms of notions of development and notions of bureaucracy and the effectiveness of the state. But there is also neighboring Haryana, which is quite different actually, in terms of, even though the societal sort of conditions and the so-called ethnicity may be similar. So does he sort of distinguish between these elements? Is there any discussion of corruption in global terms, in terms of, there are political scientists who are in public administration, people who study corruption. Our own university had one of those people who was very well known. So does he relate to that picture as well? And then finally, I think, in terms of studying everyday state, what would be a good way of studying everyday state? Can you think of, some people who have done it in a good way? Or
this sort of the last point you made first, I think that come back to my last point. That, if you're looking for an ethnography of the everyday state, you're looking for a book which it has some very interesting ethnography about how people experience the state, then this as it were is a book for you. I think it's pretty good on that. My problem with it is that it doesn't actually really seriously address the question with which he starts out. It is only a very partial answer to that question. But in terms of, I mean, Akhil really, with his 1995 American Ethnologist article, more or less launched the everyday state literature, which has become quite a growth industry of people writing ethnographies of the state in that kind of vein. And his work is still some of the best, I think. But then, to coming to your first point, no, you see, I think this is one of the ways in which the book is so limited. You don't actually learn very much about corruption. You see a little bit, the interactions of a Pathwari and a couple of boys from the village. And they don't actually do it very well. They don't quite know, what the rates are and how much they're expected to pay or in what form, So they make a mess of it and end up being really more dependent upon the Pathwari than they might have been otherwise. There's really there is no broader analysis of corruption. There's nothing remotely like, Robert Wade's account of how the system of rents works in the irrigation bureaucracy in Andhra Pradesh, worked in the irrigation bureaucracy in Andhra Pradesh 30 odd years ago. And so it doesn't really say very much about corruption at all.
Thank you. There's a question in the back there.
Yes. The question is all about the democracy and development. India and China both are the largest population in the world. India became independent in 1947, became the largest democratic country in the world in terms of population. China, the Chinese communists took over China in 1949, became the largest communist country or authoritarian government in the world. In the past 60 years, China seems to be more successful in terms of economic development, in terms of education improvement, in terms of reduction of poverty, in terms of the increasing living standards, seems more successful. Although both countries, they have many similar problems. Now my question is that, is the authoritarian governments more successful in development, or should Indian society or the Indian governments should learn something from the Chinese or the Chinese government? That's my questions.
Well, as I said in answer to an earlier question, which referred to Amartya Sen's arguments about the relationship between democracy and development, I said that quite a few political scientists have done what I call large N cross-country studies, looking at the relationships between different forms of government and development. And there is no very clear-cut relationship either between democracy and development or between authoritarian regimes and development. There are plenty of authoritarian regimes which have been absolutely disastrous in regards to economic growth and development. I think there's quite a, it is very interesting to compare the Chinese case and the Indian case. I personally think that in part, what we see the consequences of is actually a very much longer history of the very much higher levels of productivity that have been achieved in China than in India. Chinese agriculture has historically been much more productive than Indian agriculture. Average yields of rice now in China are about twice those of India. And they've pretty much always been about twice those of India, as far as I know. So there's a kind of long history of difference in agricultural productivity, certainly. And I think that China, through the brutality of land reform in 1949, 1950, actually did a lot to resolve its agrarian question, the problem of agriculture, which is somewhere at the origins of the stories of higher rates of economic growth in all these big countries. So I'm not going to buy your argument that maybe India should learn from China because of authoritarianism.
We're out of time, but I'll take a final question from.
Actually, it's been asked already, but I was wondering if you could talk more about the reasons of the failure of the Indian state in alleviating poverty. And is it to do with corruption and inefficiency and red tape and lethargy, or is it to do? I mean, what I got from Akhil Gupta was that the rationale behind the state, the reason for the thing that it prioritizes is self-perpetuation, and that's why it connives with other interests and promotes a select section of society at the expense of others. That's the reason it's failing, rather than something that it's doing wrong.
Well, I come back to what I said. I thought that was absolutely I found an extraordinary statement, where he says, this is a state which is committed to equality, redistribution of dignity, inclusion of the formerly marginal in the national project that makes the continued violence enacted on the poor so paradoxical. I don't think that the Indian state is committed to social equality. There's a lot of talk about tackling the problem of poverty. But I don't see much sign of a commitment to equality. I think that, sadly, the promise of universal inclusive citizenship with which independent India started out has largely been disappointed. And that far from citizenship becoming, more inclusive and more equal, I think it's going the other way. Why is that? Well, in part, it is because, of ideas and attitudes. But came up from the little exchange earlier with Anu. I think it has to do with the commitments of politicians and with them of bureaucrats. The absolute priority that has been given to economic growth. Yeah, I mean, and it's always said, of course, that economic growth is essential to, if our people are to be fed and the problem of poverty is to be resolved and so on. Well, yes, but I mean, that's really rather a trivial argument. Of course, there's got to be economic growth. But, economic growth can be realized in many different ways. And I believe that, we can see how the approach that has been taken to the realization of the goal of bringing about high rates of economic growth in India has led to present situation of, which I think is a little bit of a cliche now, but cliches have a point. Situation of jobless growth, and where the economy that is growing so vigorously isn't producing many productive jobs. And of course, the problem of poverty isn't going away, and insofar as it is, it's going away because the state has more resources to hand out through, well, cash transfer or Narega or PDS or whatever they decide is, whatever the current fashion says is the best way of doing it.
Thank you. On that
I know you're looking
note,
at me very
sorry.
fiercely.
So sorry. I just want to close this formally, and we'll keep it open informally, the refreshments.
Thank
so
you.
please join me in thanking Professor Harris. And let me invite everyone to refreshments. Please help yourself and continue to engage.